Welcome, everyone, to episode number 5, Wrestling with Comedy, and I am your host, the real deal, Joel Davis. Today's episode is titled, Keeping It Real Comedy in Texas? Well, here's the story. Right here, exclusive on Wrestling with Comedy podcast, you're going to hear the details to the negotiations, the backstory, and the history of the ongoing months of negotiation. Well, this is what happened, folks. And like it was said in that famous movie back in the day, that's the fact, Jack. Stripes with Bill Murray, John Candy, and Dan Aykroyd. That's the fact, Jack. That's what you're going to hear here. The facts, only the facts, when I give it to you exclusively only on this podcast, Wrestling with Comedy. You're going to hear it first. Yes, Keeping It Real Comedy promotion was in negotiation for several months to bring Keeping It Real Comedy to the state of Texas. God bless Texas. And it all started back in April, May of this year, 2025, when I was out in Texas performing stand-up comedy on 6th Street and in the surrounding areas. Rocco's Comedy Club, Shakespeare's, the Gina Bar, the Mothership, and other clubs that I had the privilege to perform on their stages out there in Texas. And that has how the contact actually happened with this promoter, general manager from Texas. When I returned to Massachusetts in May, I received an email, a long email that came in Eastern time around 2, 3 a.m. one Friday into Saturday morning. I answered the email. I check my emails 3-4 times a day. I do a lot of business through emails. And I checked the email, and the title of the email was stand-up comedy in Abilene, Texas. And I said, whoa. I said, let me see what is. And it was a long, long email that I received through NE Hall of Famer 2011 at gmail.com. And on that email, the message was from this individual that they had seen me in Texas. They had seen video of me in Texas, apparently. And they had known me as being a promoter of Keeping It Real Comedy. So what ended up happening was I read the email, of course. I read it once, twice, maybe 3 times, actually. Took notes. I take notes. Knowledge is power. I have a ton of knowledge. A wise man always expects the unexpected. And as I read it, I recognized the name. I looked, I said, wow. I said, I haven't heard this name in years. I haven't heard this name since the early 1990s. I met this gentleman way, way back in the day in professional wrestling, actually. I broke out of Kowalski's in October 25th, 91, when I started up with IWCCW. In 1993 is when I met this individual. He was running professional wrestling, independent professional wrestling in the state of Vermont, mainly, up in Vermont. He had some big, big shows. He had a big event with the main event was the Original Sheik. The Original Sheik versus Abdullah the Butcher in the main event. The Original Sheik in his corner that night had his nephew, Sabu. And I knew of him as a professional wrestling promoter, but I had no idea that he was in the stand-up comedy business. And I had no idea that he was living in Abilene, Texas. But it had been years, it had been decades since I had spoke to him. He was somewhat shady back in the day. He was actually very shady back in the day. And I was kind of hesitant when I heard read the email. But I knew he was legit. He was flying in big names in professional wrestling. He had been, in professional wrestling as a promoter. So when I read the name, I recognized the name James Quinnland. I believe it was James Quinnland III. James told me in the email as I read it, he explained that he had moved from Boston, Massachusetts to Abilene, Texas. And he lived out there a while, and he had told me in 4 or 5 paragraphs about his health condition. Ton of information I really didn't need to know about, but he felt like he had to tell me, I guess. And in the email, it said that he had this condition that he was unable to work full time, but he still was a promoter, and I was like almost like a sad story, he told me. And he had said, Joel, I'd heard you were in Texas for a 2-week run and that you're in stand-up comedy. I've been watching your YouTube videos, and I know you from professional wrestling as the real deal Joel Davis. And I said, I'm reading it was a long email. And in the email, he asked me if I'd be interested in bringing my promotion, because he knew I was a promoter, to Abilene, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Abilene, Texas. And, I said, well, he included his phone number. I mean, because, this is going to have to be, something that we'd have to speak about on the phone before I'd even start to think about doing anything like this. Of course, I was very interested because I had met some great contacts in Texas. A lot of comedians in Texas, looking for work, and it would have, it was going to be a bigger show the way the talk was. And I said, wow, this is great. I could maybe bring in 1 or 2 comedians from this area and then use 1 or 2 or 3 comedians from Texas. About giving opportunities, like I've spoke to everyone here about in past podcasts. I'm going to, I like to be an opportunist, to give opportunities to people. Something that is not easy to come by in stand-up comedy or any entertainment field or any business in general. So I said, wow, this is going to be good. It's going to be real good. Keeping It Real Comedy coming to Abilene, Texas. And yes, is Keeping It Real Comedy debuting in Abilene, Texas? Stay tuned. I'm going to tell you more. I get on the phone with James Quinnland that next day after I actually requested his phone number. And I called him directly. And we started speaking. He didn't hesitate. He didn't stutter. He had ideas. And he asked me a lot of questions about stand-up comedy. And I told him, I said, listen, I said, James, I says, what are we talking about here? Like a budget-wise. He got into what he was looking for. And he had told me that he had just become the manager at, it's right here, I get some of my notes here. I take notes on everything that I work with. Hef's Burger and Bar. That was in front of a mall in Abilene, Texas. He was the new manager. They were doing the whole place all over again, renovating it. And that I had brought in some big bands, Aerosmith cover bands, tribute bands, and the Eagles tribute band, some big classic rock and roll in general, even some country bands apparently. And it's going to be even a bigger cedar building. It was going to be capacity of 300 to 350 people would fit in the building. And it was something that they wanted to run quarterly, every 3 months. I said, wow, this is great, James. I said, I really appreciate you reaching out to me and giving me this possible opportunity. And he had said, no, Joel, listen, I know you're a hard worker. He says, you're in comedy now. He said, I remember you, from back in the day. I said, yeah, I remember you, James. I said, and again, I appreciate the opportunity. I said, but we have to talk numbers. We have to talk about what we're doing here. Like, what do you want? What are you really looking for? And he said, well, I really want to get 2 professional wrestlers that converted over to stand-up comedians to be on these shows that we're going to run at the Hef's Burger and Bar in Abilene, Texas. I said, James, I can make that happen. He says, yes. He said, I want you to be one of the former pro wrestlers, the real deal Joel Davis. I said, absolutely. I said, yeah. I said, I can bring in, I can come in as maybe a feature or a host, or I says, and we can bring in a big headliner. I mean, there are some big names that I have contacts with that are comedians. And 2 of them in particular are Rob Van Dam and Jake the Snake Roberts. And he had said, yeah, he says, I'm also interested in Cactus Jack. I said, yeah, well, I can get a hold of him. What's our budget? And I had some other big comedians that, they're out in Texas that I had considered to contact right away, and that's the God's honest truth. One, a good friend of mine, Kill Tony, Golden Ticket winner, Funny Charlie Mark. That's Charlie Mack. Funny Charlie Mack would be definitely given that opportunity if he was interested, as possibly, more than likely, he'd be the headliner. And we'd move the former pro wrestler to the feature, possibly me being the host, and then throwing in one other comedian out there in Texas. Some great comedians out there that work really hard that I'd love to give the opportunity to for this big event every 3 months, 4 big shows. And, we talked about it, and the ball was rolling. I had the notepad out, and with 3 or 4 conversations, we started talking about numbers, like as far as what the budget was. And he had, up to a close to a 5-digit figure he was talking at one point for some of the other entertainment that this venue's been working with, a 5-digit figure. And he had talked to me about a nice 4-digit figure that would definitely accommodate everybody. And I'd, want to make sure that everyone, was taken care of, including transportation. And there'd be 4 to 5 comedians on these shows. So we had 3, 4, 5 conversations on the phone, a couple of emails, taking notes. I started reaching out to different individuals. And I told James Quinnland, I said, listen, I said, we can make this happen. I said, this is the way we can make it happen. Here's the times. Here's who this is why I have for ideas. Rob Van Dam would be great for the first show. Then we could maybe bring in Cactus Jack. I can try to get a hold of Charlie Mack. There's another gentleman out in Texas, that great guy, Gordon Dixon, who I had thought about definitely to be a part of these shows. He was also another Kill Tony bucket pull, Gordon Dixon. He's a bar manager over there at the Shakespeare's Bar in Texas. So I don't think it would be too much travel. I started looking into what Austin, Texas to Abilene, Texas, what the travel would be. A lot of details, a lot of time spent, a lot of notes, a lot of research done for these shows coming to Texas. Keeping It Real Comedy debuting in Abilene, Texas. This went on for the summer, 2 or 3, 4 months into the summer. By the second month in the summer, when we were getting down to making it happen, we basically had a date for September of this year. And obviously, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that show didn't happen in September, because as a promoter and producer, if you know anything about me, I'd have that thing plastered on social media. Will this shows ever happen? They say never say never. And it's so true. It's really a good generic saying, never say never. I won't say never. I'll say it probably ain't going to happen because I'm going to tell you what happened. And like we said, that's the fact, Jack. I asked James Quinnland for a deposit. At one point, there had to be a deposit made. And when I say a deposit, a percentage of what the actual amount that was agreed on to bring this show to the Hef's Burger and Bar in Abilene, Texas. First of all, you're talking about comedians that will have to travel, some kind of travel. I would definitely need hotel accommodation, which was agreed on, and that I would be, quote unquote, by James Quinnland, that he would pick me up at the airport and fly me in and fly me back. Detail after detail after detail. I'd get in the night before the show. The show was the Saturday night. I'd get in on the Friday. When it came down to the deposit, James Quinnland had told me, he said, that's not a problem. Let me talk with the owner. Since he's the manager, he needed to talk to the owner. So a couple days went by. He apparently talked to the owner. James and I spoke again. And he had told me, he says, talk to the owner. We're really interested. You got some great ideas here. I'm very interested in having you come in and promote these shows. And I had said, James, you know what? I said, man, this is great. And he had told me, he says, every 3 months, you as a promoter, he says, I would like to have you, as one of our comedians. I said, absolutely. I says, we can do that. I'll switch my spot on the show, switch it up a bit. I'm always writing new material. And the other 3 comedians, possibly 4 comedians, will be switched up every 3 months. He said, Joel, I'm so excited. He said, the owner's so excited. I said, well, send me that deposit, brother. I said, because now I'm trying to make some phone calls and making some arrangements. I said, we've designed the show. I've designed the show for you. I've told you about the setup, about the seating, and et cetera, et cetera. I says, but as far as like getting you actual numbers of what these comedians will require and any more details pertaining to the times of the show, like who's going on when and what the time frame should be. And it got to the point that James Quinnland was trying to get some information on running a stand-up comedy show, a live stand-up comedy show in Abilene, Texas, at Hef's Burger and Bar. That's what I started getting out of it after the second and third time I requested that deposit that I thought was, reasonable. After the third time I asked for the deposit, James came up with another excuse. Well, give me a few more days. The financial director or some crap needs to take a look at, the numbers. And I said, James, listen, man, we're not going to negotiate anymore until we come up with that deposit. Keeping It Real comedy promotion for live stand-up comedy is going to be a quality show that we're going to bring in. It's in Texas. There's some travel involved, et cetera, et cetera. There's, you're basically reaching out to me for my contact information and my knowledge. I've seen this happen before. It's happened to me multiple times. That's the God's honest truth. This goes way back in my life. People come in and, and they're asking information and they're trying to gain information and knowledge. Is there anything wrong with that? No, not really. But knowledge is power. And it took me a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of energy and studying and working at getting the knowledge and the contacts that I have. So it's like being at the bar. I shut them off. You had too much to drink, James. I'm the bartender. I'm shutting you off. I gave you some information, but maybe 50%. Did James and I have a falling out? No. Will he hear this podcast and be kind of surprised that I'm putting him on blast? Probably. Well, that's just the way it is, man. James, you know my phone number. You have my email. You know the details of bringing in a live comedy show to Abilene, Texas. You contacted me because, like you had said to me in our second phone call, you had known that I had connections still in professional wrestling, and you are a professional wrestling mark. A mark is a fan. Like a fan that's really a diehard fan. Is there anything wrong with being a mark? No, not really. But you're a big mark. And you wanted to speak to me about bringing in stand-up comedy. You liked my material. You liked the idea that I was a promoter. You knew of me. You knew I was reliable. You did book me for 2 different shows out here in New England back in the early 90s, and you knew I gave it my all. As a matter of fact, you gave me a big match there. I tagged up with Just Incredible in a tag match against the Slayer brothers from Canada in Boston, Mass. At the Expo Center. So you knew who I was. And you knew that I was a promoter in stand-up comedy and a promoter in general in sports entertainment and sports in general. So I think that's why, you thought that I'd be a good contact, and you found my email and you contacted me, which is great, man. I appreciate it, brother. But, I also, in the same sense, I don't have time to play games. I got a lot to do still in this world. And I'm going to do it. Put your money down on the real deal, Joel Davis. I just tell you a real quick 1-minute story. Back in the 90s, my intro music was back and forth. I ended up with Queen, We Will Rock You for most of my intros. But I had a couple different songs that I brought in. One in particular was Too Legit to Quit. It was a popular song in the early 90s, 1992. Too Legit to Quit. I think about it, I say, shit, that's me, man. I'm not quitting. I'm too legit to quit. And anybody that's involved working with me or associates of mine or personal friends, even casual friends, associates that's worked with me in stand-up comedy, professional wrestling, I believe you know that, and I back up everyone. I try to give it my all and try to bring everybody along for the ride, so to speak. But James Quinnland, Abilene, Texas, it's right here, Hef's Burger and Bar. He's the new manager over there. He's the exclusive manager, and he wants to bring in live stand-up comedy, but he wants professional wrestlers that are comedians to be involved in these shows because James is a mark. James, I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy that's going to be coming out to Abilene, Texas to do a show so you can get my autograph, take pictures with me, meet Rob Van Dam and Jake Roberts and possibly Cactus Jack on my dime, and not get compensated in a big way. And I'm not going out there for 2 or 3 beans. And I'm not promoting a show and going out there and performing for four beans either. It's like, they say if you want to play, you got to pay. Will Keeping It Real comedy promotion debut, will Keeping It Real comedy bring live stand-up comedy with professional wrestling and stand-up comedy combined together? Former retired professional wrestlers who became comedians, including myself, the real deal Joel Davis, possibly Rob Van Dam, Cactus Jack Foley, Jake the Snake Roberts. Shit, I even told him I'll get Tony Atlas to come in. He asked me, he said, is he a comedian? I said, no, but he will be that night. Tony's a great guy. I have the contacts. I'm not living delusional, or it's not a fantasy. And I'm sure to hell not a mock. James Quinnland, get me the deposit, brother. Now we're in November. The show was scheduled 2 months ago. I will still do business with you. I don't take it personal. Believe me, it's business. I get it. I'm a grown man. I've been around for decades. If you didn't know, you better call somebody. It's so true. That's how I roll. That's how I always have rolled. I give it 1,000%. I always will. I would love to bring Keeping It Real comedy to Abilene, Texas, at the Hef's Burger and Bar that you are managing now, that you're able to manage even with your health condition. James, it's not personal. I don't dislike you. I'm not trying to put you on blast here. But I'm just telling the facts. And you know that these are the facts. And my listeners and watchers of the podcast, Wrestling with Comedy, need to know, they will know all the facts. I'm always going to keep it real on here, just like I do in life. Never say never. Keeping It Real comedy promotion, live comedy, with former pro wrestlers and big uprising stars and stars in comedy, including golden ticket winners of the Kill Tony show in Abilene, Texas, under the Keeping It Real comedy banner with the real deal Joel Davis, your promoter and producer. Will it happen in 2026? James Quinnland just called me last week and we spoke again. Until next time, keep it real at all costs.